Hey, well, I've been trying to upload some videos from the television series called Mr. Robot, but almost all of them are flagged as copyright material and places a limitation upon them. So I've decided to try to take some still photographs from the show Mr. Robot and use them to present my thoughts and information. So in this one episode, Elliot is up against the wall over here on the left, and this is his father. Now his father is deceased, but in the television show, his father appears over and over and over again to Elliot, because obviously Elliot has delusions, and Elliot might come under the category of a schizophrenic. Now, over to the right is Elliot's mother, who is deceased, and this is supposedly Elliot when he's little. But Elliot is up against the wall here. And Elliot is yelling out, "This isn't my family. None of them are real." Now, that's exactly what you need to do and what I need to do with the information that is presented to us in the mass media. You need to scream out like Elliot, "None of them are real," R-E-A-L. Now I have a channel called Real, R-E-A-L, or Real, R-E-E-L, meaning film reel. So these are projections of Elliot's mind, and he's battling right now, and he's trying to tell them they are not real. Now, if you want out of the Hoax-Lie system, you have to scream out like Elliot and say, "None of them are real." And there's Elliot. Okay, and this is his father's hand right here. And he's insisting, "You're not real." Now, I might add to that, they are real, R-E-E-L. They are films. They are projections. They are projections of the mind. But most of the world around you believes they are real, R-E-A-L. But you, because you have come out of Hoax-Lie system, you know they're just sort of projected fantasies. So then his father, Elliot's father, screams back at him, "Is any of it real?" So Elliot's insisting that the father and the mother over here, and this would be Elliot when he's little, and the father's yelling back to him in his mind, in his dialogue in his mind, okay? Is any of it real? Now this is the part that I really wanted to convey in movie fashion as it was presented in the television episode. However, it's not being shown. So I've had 4 of them removed or just disappeared. I don't even know where they are. They went into Lululand. But he yells out, "Is any of it real?" So now we're going to turn our attention to society. Look at it. Now that's me right there. Okay? Many years ago. And that's the hands of someone that was on YouTube doing what I'm doing right now and insisting that I look at it. Now, the hands here for me, those hands were the hands of Dave J. or Dave Johnson. And Dave has kind of backed away. He does have some work up on YouTube. Just type in Dave J, no space, all small letters, and that's his channel. But Dave is the one that got hold of me like this, and he said, look at it. I'm forcing you to look at it. What do you see? It is an entire world built on fantasy. Fantasy. It's a lot like the old television show with Ricardo Montalban. Fantasy Island. The plane, boss. The plane. Here comes the plane. They're coming to Fantasy Island. Now, this is where most people live today. They live in a fantasy world. But thank God I was taken out of the fantasy world, which has made me somewhat of a loner. And if you're watching my videos, you're somewhat of a loner as well. We're a little like Elliot because we know too much. So what is this fantasy world? He's going to give us some points or some structure or some pillars about this fantasy world. First of all, the fantasy world is built on emotions. And by the way, in the science of fear or in the conveying of propaganda, it is primarily targeting emotions. Because if you can win the emotions, you have won the individual. And in the book called The Science of Fear, there are two systems that he identifies, and one is kind of like your brain, accurate information processed like a computer in the brain, and the other is your emotions. And if the emotions are stimulated, the emotions will override correct thinking. That is why you can be 100% correct with someone in trying to bring down the Hoax-Lie system, and your logic is absolutely flawless, but they will not take down the fantasy world. Why? Because it's the emotion that is controlling them, not good, sound thinking. Okay? So he talks about synthetic emotion, forms of pills, which is, a lot of pharmaceutical industry has had a major impact on our society. And I remember several years ago when the pharmaceutical industry found its way into the lives of children and youth in grade schools, high schools, and everybody getting diagnosed with ADD or something, and a vast majority of young people going on some very powerful psychotropic drugs. That's just one example. But he's saying that a lot of folks have come under the power of the pharmaceutical industry. So their emotions are really out of whack. Now the next thing he identifies, the second thing, is psychological warfare. Now he says in the form of advertising. And that is true. Advertising is probably the best example of persuasion. How we get persuaded to buy things we don't need. How we get persuaded to go from something that's good and working to something that's better. And then it never stops. So yes, advertising is a very good example of psychological warfare. However, there are other forms of psychological warfare that are being played upon you and me. So it's not just advertising. Okay, let's go to the next one. Mind-altering chemicals in the form of food. Now there's a lot could be said here. The one thing that I'd like to identify is this. In many of the favorite foods of people, there are chemicals that actually create the craving for that particular food. And then once you start eating them, you want more and more and more. So there's an addiction that occurs for a particular food. Now what if you have several foods filled with these chemicals that cause addiction? Now you're addicted to several foods or beverages even. And then hence your body begins to produce layers of fat. And we have here in America an incredible problem with obesity, which leads to diabetes, which leads to all types of medical problems, illnesses, and diseases. So yes, this show is accurate, and that's why I really wanted to show it in the form of the show itself. But maybe this is even better to just break it down little by little. So he's doing a speech for Elliot. And remember now, this is Elliot's father, and he doesn't really exist, except he exists in the mind of Elliot because he's deceased. But Elliot conjures him up and works with him in his various hacking projects and so forth. And by the way, this is Mr. Robot right here. And the reason I believe he's called that is that he had when he was alive, he had a shop whereby he fixed computers and sold computer parts and things like that. And I think it was the name of his shop, Mr. Robot. But anyhow, we'll go on to the next one. Brainwashing seminars in the forms of media. Well, that sure summarizes what is called the news. Brainwashing seminars. It could also include things like documentaries, investigative reporting. Yes, even our favorite television shows have been nothing but brainwashing seminars. Let's go on to the next one. Controlled, isolated bubbles in the form of social networks. So all this social network stuff, what has it done to society? Well, I'll tell you what it's done. The other day I had to go to the dental office, and when I arrived in the waiting room, there were 4 people sitting in the waiting room, and all 4 of them were engrossed in their cell phones. Not a word was being spoken to one another in that office, in that waiting area. And I could multiply that over for you in other contexts, restaurants, airports. You name it. You just see people sitting there completely absorbed in their phone. Now, is this correct? An isolated bubble. So what we think has really helped us has just caused isolation. And that's what controllers want. They want isolation. They don't want people to be talking to someone like me. They don't want others talking to someone like you. Because we know a lot, and we might pop some of their false bubbles in their thinking and correct their thinking and get them out from under the power of the emotion. Get them out from under the power of hypnosis. So Elliot's father is crying out to Elliot, real? You think I'm not real? Meaning the father. Well, what about the whole society around you? Is it really real? Now, once again, the title of my other channel, Real or Real, R-E-E-L. What are you really, really looking at? There's a pun there. What are you really looking at? Now, Elliot's father will yell out, we haven't lived in anything remotely close to it since the turn of the century. Now, I'm going to identify the turn of the century as leaving the 1800s and going into the 1900s. Now, the reason I identify that as the turn of the century is because life was very simple and hardly anybody was exposed to anything that we know of what we call mass media. And basically folks lived on farms, folks had their own food that they grew on the farm, and there was a great concern for morality and on and on. So that's my thought about the turn of the century. But he's trying to tell us that yes, there has been a transition from real, R-E-A-L, to real, R-E-E-L. Now he's saying we turned it off and took out the batteries. What he means is basically society rejected reality, true reality, for a false reality. Now, once again, the spiritual component of this is that the false reality is run by Lucifer, because he's the deceiver. He's the great deceiver. And he empowers the system. So those who run the system and are an intricate part of the system are empowered by the deceiver himself, the devil. And of course the devil has quite an army to assist him in his work, powers and principalities and demons and evil spirits. We snacked on a bag of GMOs, okay? In other words, we just let it happen. We fed our own pleasures while reality slipped away from us. And tossed the remnants into the ever-expanding dumpster of the human condition. How do you like that for a summary of life? The dumpster of the human condition. So what a terrible, perverted view of life. And that is exactly what the devil does. He always perverts the holy and good things of God Almighty. And he always twists the truth, such as the devil twisted the truth when he took Jesus up high up on the mountains and gave him the temptations. He was always twisting the scriptures. Okay, now he's talking about housing, I guess, physical housing, and he calls them branded houses. Now, this could be a reference to the whole idea that, basically speaking, people own nothing. Now, that might surprise you. It might frighten you. It might get you angry at me. But here's what really happens. For example, when you, quote, purchase a car and you get it paid off and you get a certificate of title and you think you own it. And that's probably the best thing in life, to just think you own it, because once you realize you don't own anything, life gets a little bit strange. No, you have a certificate of title. You don't have the title. The title is buried somewhere in some bank, some corporation, and it's the same thing with a home. Why do you think if somebody spends their whole lifetime and pays a mortgage off, and then for some reason they can't pay their taxes, the man comes and puts a sign up on their door and evicts them, gets them out of there. And then the state takes the house because they didn't pay taxes, but yet they spent an entire lifetime paying their mortgage. Why? Because in essence it never was theirs. The deed to the house was buried somewhere in a bank and owned by some corporation. Now, I think that's what he means by branded houses, but I'm not entirely sure. This little phrase, bipolar numbers, jumping up and down on digital displays, that could possibly be a reference to the stock market. Now, the stock market is fixed, and I did a video about the crash of 1929 from an old black and white movie. It's on my War Backwards is Raw channel. I'll try to maybe get a copy of it and put a link in this video or put it on this channel. But anyhow, in that video I tried to show that the symbolism in that movie suggested strongly that yes, even the great crash of 1929 was just a manipulation by the controllers who control the economy, hypnotizing us into the biggest slumber mankind has ever seen. Now, I've done a lot of videos on hypnos. Hypnos, the demon power that allows for people to live in this state of slumber. Now, a state of slumber, you might say, is just sort of like a form of death. And in Greek mythology, hypnos has a twin brother, thanatos, death. And they work together, and that's why most of your hoaxes are about death. That's why. Because those two work together extremely well. And back to Dave J. Dave has told us over and over, do not false witness death. Do not false witness death. And Dave is 100% correct. Because if you can bring down the false witness of death, you can get out from the power of hypnos. So hypnotizing us into the biggest slumber mankind has ever seen. And that would be the condition of the world. Now, of course, as he's saying this, all these people in the crowd are happy and rejoicing. They're saying they're awake now because Elliot has succeeded in crashing down the financial information about people's debts. So supposedly in this episode, the masses have been released from financial debt. And you notice over here in the corner it says awake, awake. So they're saying they're awake, but they're not really awake. They're just being pulled into another power and another scam, that's all. You have to dig pretty deep, kiddo, before you can find anything real. Well, that's the challenge that you face, and the challenge I face, to dig deep and find something real, R-E-A-L. And the only way you're going to do that is to discover life on your own. Sorry to say, but the mass media is going to totally mislead you. And, sorry to say, maybe many of your friends will mislead you. Yes, even family members will mislead you because they don't understand that they've been living in that entire world of fantasy. And they've been asleep. They've been under the power of hypnos. We live in a kingdom of BS. Well, boy, that sure summarizes the condition of the world around you right now. That sure summarizes where 95% of the people you know are living. It's BS, whatever it is. But because they're under hypnos, they're under the power of hypnosis, and under the power of the devil, it's a world of illusion, and they accept it as reality. A kingdom you've lived in far too long. Now remember, here he is yelling. This is the father here, and Elliot's over here, off screen. You can't see him. And of course, this is supposed to be Elliot's mother. She's gone. And this is supposed to be Elliot when he's a little boy. And they're yelling and screaming at him that nothing around you is real. So what's the big deal? Why don't you just accept us? Why don't you just let us help run your life for you? Now remember, in the show, he would be considered schizophrenic. He also is a drug user, so there's a lot going on in his mind. A kingdom you've lived in far too long. Now that's the clue. That's the clue to get out from under this hoax-lie system. You need to go to another kingdom, and the kingdom is the kingdom of God. With Jesus Christ as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, who's not a liar, who is the way, the truth, and the life. Now that's the kingdom. And if you live in that kingdom, the kingdom of BS comes down. So making Jesus your king is the answer. And getting the mind of Christ. And Dave J. used to always talk about that, the mind of Christ. So the father's yelling at Elliot, so don't tell me about not being real. In other words, you've been duped by society, so you might as well let me dupe you. Now again, this is all just going on in his mind. They're not really actually there because he's struggling mentally. And he cries out, "No!" Now that's That's the angst. That's the anxiety that we endure as YouTubers who are seeking truth. We got this cry, just like Elliot, like, no, no, go away, falsehood, go away, liars, go away, fantasy world. Then he yells out, I want to be alone. And that's some of his problem, that when he gets alone, he gets very depressed, and he gets deeply involved in drug usage. I believe it's morphine. And then he retreats and goes into a shell. And that's what we can end up doing if we're not careful. I actually went through a little bit of this myself and didn't make any videos. And I was almost at the point where I was going to completely take down all my channels and have nothing more to do with this. Well, thank the Lord I didn't, and I didn't end up being alone too long. I came out of my shell. But for a few minutes, well, maybe a couple, about 3 weeks or so, I was like Elliot. Just leave me completely alone. I don't want anything more to do with this fantasy world, and I don't even want to try to explain it to anybody anymore. I'm just done. I'll just hack life completely by myself. Well, I'm not doing that, and you're not doing that, and so I'm thanking you that you're there, my brother, my sister, my friend, my colleague, my neighbor. Whatever title you want me to assign, I would like to assign it to you and say, I don't want to be alone. I want you there. And I love it when you send me a comment on any of my channels for any videos, just to know you're there. I'm not alone. So I want to thank you. So he drops his head, and the next part of this particular episode is Elliot will be alone, and the whole crowd will just disappear. And then, of course, his father and mother will speak to him from a screen, a movie screen, which is interesting. He goes from real to R-E-A-L to R-E-E-L. So I'd really like to thank you for watching this, and an extra thank you if you got to the end of this video. This concludes the video.